The rain drummed softly against the windows of the small cafe, casting a misty glow through the glass. Inside, the warm scent of freshly brewed coffee, mixed with the comforting aroma of toasted bread and melted butter. It was a quiet evening, with only a few customers scattered around, lost in their own worlds. In the farthest corner of the cafe, Ethan Carter sat alone, his calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. His worn-out denim jacket was draped over the back of his chair, damp from the rain outside. He had just finished another exhausting day at the woodworking shop, his muscles aching from lifting and shaping heavy planks of wood. But despite the fatigue, he found solace in this small cafe, a place where he could simply exist, without expectations or obligations. Across the room, Isabella Monroe sat by the window, staring at the raindrops racing down the glass. Unlike her usual polished appearance, tonight she wore a simple hoodie and jeans, blending into the ordinary world she had always felt so distant from. The weight of corporate meetings, investor expectations, and the never-ending scrutiny of her public image had drained her. Tonight, she didn't want to be a billionaire CEO. She just wanted to be a person. When the waiter arrived with the bill, Isabella instinctively reached for her personally to realize with horror that her wallet was missing. Panic set in as she rummaged through her coat pockets, her pulse quickening. The waiter's expression shifted from polite patience to quiet frustration. "Ma'am, we have a policy. Payment is required before leaving." Ethan, watching from his table, noticed her growing distress. Something about her uneasy posture, the way she bit her lip in embarrassment, tugged at his sense of kindness. Without a second thought, he stood up and walked over. The rain had cleared by the next evening, leaving behind the crisp scent of damp pavement and autumn air. The cafe was quieter tonight, its warm glow inviting against the darkened streets. Ethan Carter sat at his usual corner booth, a book open in front of him, though his eyes had barely skimmed the words. His mind kept drifting back to the woman from the night before, the way she had nervously searched for her wallet, the way she had hesitated when he stepped in to help, and most of all, the quiet gratitude in her eyes as she had handed him that napkin with her number written on it. Isabella Monroe had spent the entire day thinking about their encounter as well. She was used to people wanting things from her. Investors wanted her time, employees wanted her leadership, the media wanted her image, and acquaintances wanted her wealth. But he thought he had simply helped her, no questions asked, without expecting anything in return. It was rare, and for the first time in a long while, she found herself wanting to repay kindness not out of obligation, but because it mattered. Stepping into the cafe, she scanned the room until her gaze landed on him. He looked different than most men she had met. There was an unpolished ease about him, the kind of quiet confidence that didn't demand attention but held its own presence. He hadn't noticed her yet, his brow furrowed in thought as he absent-mindedly tapped his fingers against the worn pages of his book. Taking a deep breath, she walked over. "Mind if I join you?" Ethan looked up, startled for a moment, before recognition softened his expression. "Oh," he said, setting his book aside. "Yeah, sure." She slid into the seat across from him, placing a small envelope on the table. "I wanted to come back and thank you properly," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You didn't have to do that last night, but you did, and I really appreciate it." Ethan glanced at the envelope, then back at her. "You don't have to pay me back." "I insist," she replied, nudging it toward him. "It's only fair." He hesitated before picking it up, unfolding it just enough to see the cash inside far more than the cost of a bowl of soup. He let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "This is way too much." "Considerate interest," Isabella said with a small smile. "Or maybe just my way of saying thank you." Ethan studied her for a moment. She was different tonight, less guarded, more at ease. "All right," he said, tucking the envelope into his jacket. "Thank you." They sat in comfortable silence for a beat before Isabella spoke again. "So, do you come here often?" Ethan smirked. "That's usually my line." She laughed softly, and something in his chest tightened at the sound. "Yeah," he admitted. "It's kind of my place after work. Helps me unwind." "What do you do?" "I'm a carpenter. I work at a small shop downtown, mostly furniture repair. Custom pieces when I get lucky. It's nothing fancy, but it pays the bills." She tilted her head, intrigued. "Do you like it?" Ethan leaned back slightly, considering. "Yeah, I do. I didn't grow up with much, so working with my handset feels honest. There's something satisfying about taking something broken and making it whole again. Isabella felt something stir in her chest. He spoke about his work not in terms of ambition for wealth, but in terms of meaning. It was a kind of passion she hadn't seen in a long time. "And you?" Ethan asked. "What do you do?" Isabella hesitated, carefully choosing her words. "I work in business consulting." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. She wasn't ready to reveal who she was not yet. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "That explains the nice coat," he teased, and she laughed. Their conversation flowed more easily after that. They talked about books, Ethan revealing his love for classic literature, while Isabella confessed she hadn't had time to read in years. He shared funny stories from the woodworking shop, and she found herself laughing more than she had in months. Ethan was captivated by her, the way she listened with genuine interest, the way she asked questions not out of politeness but curiosity. And Isabella, for the first time in a long time, felt seen not for her last name or her wealth, but for the person she was beneath it all. As the days passed, their meetings became more frequent. They found themselves gravitating toward the cafe night after night, each encounter stretching longer than the last. They shared coffee, stories, and quiet moments of understanding that didn't need words. But as their connection deepened, so did Isabella's growing guilt. She wasn't lying, but she wasn't telling the whole truth either. She feared that the moment Ethan learned who she really was, everything would change. One evening, as they lingered over half-empty coffee mugs, Ethan's words caught her off guard. "You know," he said, stirring his drink, "I've met a lot of people who think money fixes everything. But it doesn't. I've seen too many guys in expensive suits who forget what real work feels like." Isabella's stomach twisted. He didn't know, but his words still stung, not because he was wrong, but because she was part of that world, the one he clearly resented. Later that night, as she lay in her penthouse apartment staring out at the city skyline, she wondered, would Ethan still look at her the same way if he knew the truth? Would he still see the woman in the cafe, or just another name with a fortune attached? She wasn't sure she wanted to find out, not yet. But fate, as always, had a way of making decisions for her. The night air was thick with the hum of the city, a blend of distant car horns and the rhythmic buzz of neon signs flickering in the darkness. Ethan sat at his usual booth in the cafe, his fingers drumming absent-mindedly against the rim of his coffee cup. The place was quieter than usual, the late hour driving away most of the regulars. He should have gone home, but instead, he found himself waiting, though for what? He wasn't entirely sure. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was the hope that she would walk through the door, just as she had every night for the past few weeks. But tonight was different. Tonight, Isabella was late. It wasn't the first time she had been caught up in something new. She had a busy life, though she had always been vague about the details. But there was a sinking feeling in his gut, an unease that settled deep in his bones. Something felt off. He glanced at his phone. No messages. Just as he was about to call it a night, movement outside the window caught his eye. He turned just in time to see her standing on the sidewalk, her arms crossed over her chest as she spoke to a sharply dressed man. The sleek black town car parked at the curb gleamed under the streetlights, the kind of car that didn't belong in a neighborhood like this. Ethan frowned. He had seen Isabella dressed simply, her effortless elegance muted in a way that made her seem like any other ordinary woman trying to escape the weight of a long day. But this was different. The way the man spoke to her, the way she carried herself, this wasn't just some business consultant catching a ride home. This was something else. Before he could stop himself, he pushed open the cafe door and stepped outside. The night air was cooler now, but it did nothing to calm the heat rising in his chest. He didn't approach immediately, but he didn't have to. Isabella spotted him almost instantly. For a moment, she looked caught between two worlds. "Ethan," she said, her voice too steady, too controlled. The man beside her arched a brow, his gaze flicking toward Ethan with mild curiosity. He was older, refined in a way that only came with wealth and power. "And who is this?" he asked smoothly. Isabella hesitated. "Just a friend." The words were like a slap, unexpected and sharp. "Just a friend." Ethan swallowed the bitterness on his tongue and took a step forward. "Didn't know you had a driver," he said, nodding toward the car. Isabella's eyes flickered with something, guilt maybe. "He's not my driver," she admitted. "I work for Miss Monroe," the man interrupted, his tone polite but firm. "And she has a prior engagement. Miss Monroe." The name echoed in Ethan's mind, a string of puzzle pieces snapping into place all at once. He had never asked for her last name, he had never needed to. But now, standing here, he realized just how little he actually knew. Isabella opened her mouth, but Ethan shook his head. "Don't," he said, voice quieter now, laced with something raw. "Not here." She nodded, hesitating for only a second before turning to the man. "Tell them I'll be late." The man frowned, but with a curt nod he stepped back toward the car. As soon as the door shut behind him and the vehicle pulled away, Isabella turned to Ethan, but he was already walking back toward the cafe. He didn't wait for her. He didn't need to. She followed anyway. Inside, the cafe felt smaller than before, the warm lights casting long shadows across the wooden floors. Ethan slid into the booth, and Isabella took the seat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "So," he started, his voice low but steady. "Miss Monroe?" Isabella flinched. "Ethan, How long were you planning on keeping this up?" He cut in, his jaw tight. "The whole ordinary girl act?" "It wasn't an act," she said quickly, her voice pleading. "I never lied to you. You never told me the truth either," Ethan shot back. "That's the same damn thing." She swallowed hard. "I wanted to," she admitted, "but I didn't know how." Ethan scoffed, leaning back against the booth. "How about starting with the fact that you're not just some business consultant? That you're a millionaire who owns half the damn city?" "I don't own half the city," she muttered, but it was weak. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to piece everything together. "Do you know how ridiculous this sounds? I've been sitting here telling you about my struggles, about how I work paycheck to paycheck, and you what? Went back to your penthouse after every conversation, knowing that none of it applied to you?" Isabella bit her lip. "That's not fair, isn't it?" Ethan snapped. "You let me believe we were on the same page, that we were—" He stopped himself before he could say it. He wasn't even sure what they were anymore. She inhaled shakily. "I didn't want you to see me like that." Ethan's eyes darkened. "Like what?" "Like everyone else does," she whispered. "Like a bank account. Like a name instead of a person." Ethan's anger wavered just slightly, but the hurt still lingered. "So what? You thought I'd treat you differently if I knew." She looked down. "I was scared." Ethan let out a slow breath. "Yeah," he murmured. "So am I." She looked up then, her expression filled with something unreadable. "Ethan, He shook his head. "I don't know how to process this, Isabella. You're not who I thought you were." Her breath hitched. "I'm still me. Are you?" The question hung between them, heavy with everything unsaid. She blinked, her hands tightening into fists. "Yes," she said fiercely. "I am, and I care about you. That hasn't changed." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his mind warring with his heart. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to take her at her word. But trust, once broken, wasn't so easily repaired. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I need time." Isabella's heart clenched. "Time?" He nodded, standing from the booth. "To think, to figure out what this even means." She swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. "Okay." He hesitated for only a second before walking toward the door. He didn't look back. As the bell chimed softly behind him, Isabella felt the weight of her choices settle heavily on her shoulders. She had spent so long trying to escape the expectations of her world, trying to find something real, and in the process, she had nearly lost the one thing that mattered most. Ethan was gone, and she didn't know if he would come back. Ethan stood in the dimly lit garage, his hands gripping the edge of the workbench as he tried to steady his breathing. The weight of everything that had happened pressed heavily on his chest. The confrontation with Isabella's father, the ultimatum she had faced, and now the lingering uncertainty of what came next. He had spent his entire life trying to prove that he was more than just a mechanic, more than the son of a man who had walked out on his family, and yet, in Richard Monroe's eyes, he would always be nothing. The night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional drip of rainwater from the edges of the roof. Ethan exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. His phone buzzed on the workbench. It was Isabella. His heart clenched at the sight of her name, the internal battle raging once again. Did she regret choosing him? Had her father finally convinced her that he wasn't worth it? He hesitated for a moment before finally answering. "Isabella," he said, his voice softer than he had intended. There was silence on the other end, then a deep breath. "Ethan, can we talk?" Something in her tone sent a chill down his spine. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Can you meet me?" Without hesitation, Ethan grabbed his keys and headed for the door. The coffee shop was nearly empty when Ethan arrived. Isabella sat at a corner table, a cup of tea in front of her, though she hadn't touched it. She looked exhausted, her usual poised confidence dimmed by something deeper. When she saw him, relief flashed across her face, but there was still tension in her posture. He slid into the seat across from her. "Tell me what's going on." She hesitated, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "My father, he's not letting this go." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What did he do?" She exhaled, shaking her head. "He froze my accounts, cut me off completely." Tu knew he would retaliate, but I didn't think he'd go this far. A mixture of anger and concern coursed through Ethan. "So what now?" Isabella met his gaze, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know. I thought I was prepared for this, but..." She swallowed hard. "It's harder than I thought." Ethan reached across the table, covering her hands with his. "You don't have to do this alone, Isabella." She let out a shaky laugh. "I never thought I'd be in this position. I spent my whole life never having to worry about money, about security. And now, I don't even know where to start." "You start by realizing that you're stronger than your father thinks," Ethan said firmly. "You're not just some heiress living off his name. You're smart, capable. You'll figure this out." She looked at him, studying his face as if searching for some reassurance. "And if I can't?" Ethan's grip on her hands tightened slightly. "Then I'll be here, no matter what." The following weeks were some of the most difficult they had faced. Without her father's financial support, Isabella had to learn how to navigate a world she had never experienced before. Finding a job was a challenge. Her last name carried too much weight, and most companies were either afraid of hiring her or eager to use her for her connections. Frustration built as rejection after rejection piled up. Ethan, meanwhile, was doing everything he could to help her. He picked up extra shifts at the garage, working late into the night to make ends meet. Isabella hated seeing him exhaust himself for her sake, but every time she tried to protest, he would just smile and say, "We're in this together." One evening, after another unsuccessful job interview, Isabella collapsed onto their small couch, rubbing her temples. "Maybe my father was right," she murmured. Ethan, who had just set 2 plates of food on the table, turned to her sharply. "Don't say that." She let out a bitter laugh. "He said I wouldn't last without his money. And look at me, I can't even get a basic job." Ethan sat beside her, taking her hands in his. "Your father didn't cut you off because he wanted to teach you a lesson. He did it because he wanted to control you. And if you give up now, then he wins." She looked at him, the weight of his words settling in. "Then what do I do?" Ethan thought for a moment before a small smile tugged at his lips. "You do what you've always wanted to do. Build something for yourself. You're more than just a last name, Isabella. It's time to show the world that." His words struck a chord within her. She had spent so long living under her father's shadow, following the path he had laid out for her. But now she had the chance to forge her own. That night, for the first time in weeks, Isabella felt a spark of hope. Determined to prove herself, Isabella threw herself into the challenge. She reached out to old connections, not the ones tied to her father's empire, but the ones who had seen her potential before her last name had defined her. Slowly but surely, doors began to open. She secured a position at a startup consulting firm, a modest role but one that gave her purpose. It wasn't glamorous, and the paycheck was nothing compared to what she had been used to, but it was hers. Meanwhile, Ethan had been working tirelessly on his own dream. With the help of some friends, he had managed to lease a small space to open his own garage. It wasn't much, just a 2-bay shop with secondhand equipment, but it was his. One evening, as they sat on the floor of their tiny apartment, surrounded by takeout boxes and paperwork, Isabella looked over at Ethan and smiled. "You know," she said, resting her head against his shoulder, "we're kind of making this work." Ethan chuckled. "We're just stubborn enough to make anything work." She laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Thank you, Ethan, for believing in me even when I didn't." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Always." It wasn't until Isabella's father showed up unannounced that she realized just how much she had changed. She had been leaving work when she spotted Richard Monroe's sleek black car parked outside. He stepped out, his expression unreadable as he approached her. "Isabella," he said smoothly. "We need to talk." She crossed her arms. "I don't think we do." His gaze flickered with something unreadable. "You've made your point, but enough is enough. Come back home, we can fix this." Isabella let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "This isn't something that needs fixing, Dad. I made my choice, and I'm happy." His jaw tightened. "This life you've chosen, it's beneath you." Her expression hardened. "No, it's not. For the first time in my life, I'm free. I'm building something real, something that belongs to me. And you can't take that away." Richard studied her, as if searching for the daughter he once controlled. But she wasn't that girl anymore. After a long moment, he sighed. "You'll regret this." "No," she said, her voice steady. "I won't." And as she walked away, she knew with absolute certainty that she had finally won. She had found happiness not in wealth, not in power, but in love, in purpose, in a life she had chosen for herself. And that was worth more than anything money could buy. Ethan stood in the middle of his newly opened garage, wiping the grease off his hands as he took a deep breath. The scent of motor oil and fresh paint filled the air, blending with the late afternoon sunlight that streamed through the wide-open doors. It had been a long road to this moment, filled with struggle, heartbreak, and resilience. But now, standing here, he knew it had all been worth it. The garage wasn't just a business, was proof that he had built something for himself, on his own terms, and most importantly, he hadn't done it alone. A familiar laugh caught his attention, and he turned just in time to see Isabella step inside, carrying a bag of takeout and flashing him the smile that had become his anchor through the storm. She looked different than when they first met, less polished, more real. The designer clothes had been replaced with simple yet elegant choices, and the once manicured nails now had the occasional ink stain from long hours at work. She had changed, but more importantly, she had found herself. "Dinner delivery," she teased, setting the bag down on the nearby workbench. "Thought you might need a break before you overwork yourself into oblivion." Ethan smirked, tossing the rag onto a stool. "I was just about to call it a night." "Liar," she shot back playfully, crossing her arms. "You would have stayed here for another 3 hours if I hadn't shown up." He chuckled, knowing she was right. No matter how much had changed, one thing remained the same: he never knew when to stop. "All right, you got me." They sat together on the old couch he had dragged into the garage, unwrapping their sandwiches as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. It was moments like these that made all the struggles worth it, the quiet, simple happiness of being together. "I can't believe it's been a year," Isabella mused, taking a bite of her sandwich. "Feels like just yesterday I was sitting in that diner, panicking because I lost my wallet." Ethan chuckled at the memory. "And now look at you, survived without your father's fortune, landed a job on your own, and somehow still managed to put up with me." She rolled her eyes. "Somehow? Please, I think I deserve a medal at this point." He grinned but then softened, watching her for a moment. "I'm proud of you, you know." She looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Yeah?" "Yeah," he nodded. "You fought for your own life, for your own happiness. You didn't let your father define you. That takes guts." A warmth spread through her chest at his words. She reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "I had a pretty great person to remind me I was capable of more than I thought." Ethan squeezed her hand gently, brushing his thumb over her skin. "We did this together." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the hum of passing cars the only background noise. Isabella took a deep breath, as if preparing for something. "So, I have something to tell you." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominous." She laughed softly. "It's not bad, I promise. I was offered a promotion." His brow furrowed slightly. "That's great, right?" She nodded. "It is. It's a big step up, more responsibility, more influence." She hesitated before continuing. "But it also means moving to New York." Ethan felt his stomach drop slightly, but he forced himself to remain calm. "New York," he echoed, processing the words carefully. "I haven't accepted yet," she added quickly. "I didn't want to make any decisions without talking to you first." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "This is huge for you, Isabella." "I know," she admitted, "and I want it. But I don't want to lose what we have." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. So don't. Her eyebrows furrowed. What do you mean? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I don't want to hold you back, and I won't let distance ruin what we have. We'll figure it out, visits, calls, whatever it takes. And when the time is right, I'll come to you. Her breath hitched. You would do that? For you? He smiled. Always. Tears welled in her eyes, but she laughed through them, shaking her head. You know, you keep doing this, making me fall even more in love with you. Ethan grinned. That's the plan. She leaned in, capturing his lips in a slow, deep kiss, one filled with all the unspoken promises of the future. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his, whispering, I love you, Ethan. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I love you too, Isabella. As the night deepened and the stars twinkled above them, they sat together, knowing that no matter where life took them, they would always find their way back to each other. Their love wasn't about the circumstances, the challenges, or the distance. It was about the choice they made every day to fight for each other, to believe in each other, and to build a life together, no matter where that life led. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered. The story of Ethan and Isabella is a powerful testament to self-discovery, resilience, and the true meaning of love. Their journey reminds us that genuine connections are built on trust, honesty, and emotional support rather than wealth, status, or external success. Ethan, a hardworking mechanic, embodies integrity and dedication, showing that one's true value lies in character and perseverance rather than material possessions. Isabella, despite her privileged background, learns that happiness is not defined by luxury or societal expectations, but by personal fulfillment and the relationships we nurture. As we move forward into 2025, these lessons become increasingly relevant in a world dominated by digital presence, social comparison, and the pressure to succeed. Social media often presents curated versions of reality, where success is measured by status, possessions, and public recognition. However, Ethan and Isabella's story reminds us that authenticity is far more valuable than appearances. In a society where people often seek validation online, their journey highlights the importance of forming genuine connections based on mutual respect and emotional depth rather than superficial attraction or social standing. One of the key takeaways from their story is the importance of self-worth. Ethan initially struggles with the idea that he may not be enough for Isabella because of their financial differences, but he eventually realizes that love is not about status. It is about shared values, support, and the willingness to grow together. This is a critical lesson for anyone who has ever doubted their worth due to external factors. In 2025, it's essential to remember that true self-worth comes from within, and no one should allow societal standards to dictate their value. Another crucial lesson from their story is the power of second chances. Both Ethan and Isabella make mistakes. She allows insecurity to cloud his judgment, while she initially withholds the truth about her identity. Yet they find their way back to each other, proving that love, when built on genuine intentions, can withstand challenges. This applies to all aspects of life, whether in relationships, careers, or personal growth. The ability to forgive, move forward, and rebuild is a trait that will always hold value, especially in an ever-changing world. Their story also underscores the significance of pursuing meaningful goals. Ethan dreams of owning his own garage, not because of the financial success it may bring, but because it represents independence and purpose. Isabella, despite her corporate background, ultimately seeks fulfillment beyond wealth, choosing a life that aligns with her values. Their paths show that success is not just about making money, but about finding passion in what we do. In 2025, this is a reminder to chase careers and opportunities that bring us joy and purpose, rather than simply conforming to societal expectations. Furthermore, the story highlights the importance of emotional intelligence in relationships. Both Ethan and Isabella experience personal growth, learning to communicate, trust, and truly see each other for who they are beyond first impressions. This is a lesson that remains crucial in modern relationships, where misunderstandings and lack of communication often lead to unnecessary conflicts. Their journey teaches us to be patient, to listen, and to be willing to understand another person's perspective. Lastly, The story reinforces the idea that true love is about choosing each other every day, despite differences and obstacles. Ethan and Isabella come from different worlds, yet they find common ground through mutual respect and emotional support. This is a valuable lesson for modern relationships, where external factors often complicate love. Their story teaches us that love isn't just about grand gestures or perfect circumstances, it's about commitment, trust, and the daily effort to build something real. As we step into 2025, applying these lessons means focusing on what truly matters: authenticity, resilience, and meaningful relationships. It means letting go of superficial expectations, valuing ourselves for who we are rather than what we have, and embracing second chances with an open heart. The world is fast-paced and constantly evolving, but these timeless values will always remain the foundation of a fulfilling life. Let's take a page from Ethan and Isabella's journey and choose honesty, growth, and love in all that we do.